I think it's fair to say that most people go through at least a phase in their life where they're having a hard time connecting with those around them. Maybe it's because you don't have a lot in common with your coworkers. Maybe your school's really small. Maybe you're just kind of different than a lot of your peers. Either you're really ahead of the curve in terms of maturity, or maybe you're a little emotionally immature, you're a little bit behind, and therefore you guys just aren't lining up right. Whatever the reason is, when you're in a situation like that and you finally make a connection, it can feel like a life-saving moment. You can stop socially treading water and finally hold onto that piece of driftwood that is your newfound friend. I also don't think it's uncommon, if you find yourself in a situation like that, for the friendship maybe to not be ideal. Maybe it's not the perfect friendship. But a lot of friendships start because of proximity and convenience, if we're being honest. Maybe that coworker that you talk to so much isn't somebody who you would ever run into in your personal life, but in the office, it totally makes sense that you guys would click up. You always have the same perspective on meetings. Maybe the girl that you're in theater with is somebody who you really just don't have any social overlap with. Your friends and her friends don't really mix, but when you guys are put in a scene together and forced to rehearse, you find out that like, hey, this is actually pretty fun. And if the friendship isn't absolutely perfect, it's not that big of a deal. And especially if you struggle with a lot of social anxiety or awkwardness, you might feel like, who am I to complain? But today's case is a really tragic example of what happens when somebody is reaching out, trying to connect with other people, trying to find genuine friendship, and the person that they hold on to ends up being the worst person they could have possibly crossed paths with, let alone befriended. Guys, sorry. I was rescuing a dog. This is Lana. I have another Doberman, Dante, but Lana is a little rescue from Texas. I'm also originally from Texas. She responds best to Lonnie, but she's very cute and cuddly, and so I was making sure to introduce her to my boy, since he's a big Doberman, in a way that made everybody feel comfortable. And now they've had some time to relax. So now they're very good friends, and they've been running around my yard and they've been chasing each other, and it's been very good. The lady who's fostering her, she literally told me that she likes true crime. So I thought, who could be a better partner for this video than Lana, who already listens to true crime and really just likes to snuggle. That's right. Before we get into today's case, I just want to give a bit of a heads up. This case involves 3 minors, so both the perpetrators and the victim end up being people who are underage. Additionally, one of the people involved in this case is transgender, and I just want to take a moment to remind everybody that this is not a safe space for people to leave hateful comments about anybody in the LGBTQIA community, and it will not be tolerated. So if I see anything like that, I am going to delete it because it is my channel. Lana approves. The last thing I'm going to say before we get into the story is that while the investigation was underway, because this takes place in the UK and because it involved minors, the 2 suspects were originally anonymous. They're no longer anonymous. And because the anonymity was benefiting them, I'm going to remove it, and I will be calling them by their real names. This is also a very recent case. It just came to a close last year in 2023, so there may very well still be a lot of articles about this case where they reference the perpetrators as girl X and boy Y. So if you decide to look up anything about this case afterwards and you see that, just know that that's in alignment with the UK's rules and regulations as far as minors go in this kind of situation, but the judge on the case decided that it was not necessary, and so I'm gonna honor that decision. As always, let's start out with a little bit of background on all those involved. I would say the childhoods of everybody involved, but they are all still children, so we're just gonna go into their earlier childhoods. First, I want to start out with Brianna. Everybody who knew Brianna, her family, what limited friendships she did have, all would agree that Brianna was incredibly shy. She struggled with very severe social anxiety. But if you were just an outsider looking in, you wouldn't know this about Brianna at all. She had garnered an audience of about 31,000 followers on TikTok through doing makeup videos and tutorials, and she came across as really extroverted online. This is actually pretty common in my experience. A lot of other content creators I know who come across as super out there on the internet, who bring a lot of energy and are really vulnerable about their lives and seem super comfortable opening up, in real life are a lot of the times really shy or anxious people, and just for some reason the barrier that the internet creates makes them feel more comfortable expressing themselves, which I think can come as a surprise to a lot of people, because you just assume that this person who you're regularly seeing be so confident in front of so many people must be like that all the time. And for a lot of people, that's actually not the case, and Brianna was one of those people. Brianna was also assigned biologically male at birth, and about 2 years before the events of this case, she had come out to her family, who completely accepted her for who she had always been, and they were just glad to be let in on the secret. And from that point forward, she had gone by she, her pronouns, and she started to come across a lot more female presenting. You could definitely say that she had a hyper femme aesthetic. She was really, really good at makeup. Like I said, I mean, that's why she had the audience that she had. And from what I saw on her social media, she wore a lot of really cute outfits. Like, she would wear cute little skirts with like high socks. And overall, she just cultivated this super cute aesthetic. Because of this, when she would go to school, a lot of people would notice her right away. Because when you put together like really cute outfits every day and you're really good at doing your makeup, you just become more memorable overall. It just makes you stand out a little bit. But it's not uncommon for transgender individuals to feel really othered by their peers. It's not uncommon for classmates to be rude. It's not uncommon for people to be transphobic at school. So it seems like just in the past few years, you know, her life has changed a lot. The way she was moving through the world had changed a lot. She's thinking a lot about her identity, and on top of that, you know, when you're a female content creator, people can be pretty vicious, so I'm sure that wasn't helping. And her social anxiety had actually gotten so bad that she had become really agoraphobic, which is where you don't leave your house, you have anxiety about leaving your house, and she had to be put in a special unit at school so that she was separated from the general population for certain block times throughout the day. It was intended to help her with her anxiety by minimizing how many people she was around at once. Instead of being in these big classes and changing every period and being around tons of people in the halls, she was in a smaller unit. A problem that a lot of people have with this sort of unit system is that they send a lot of different kids into this same unit for different reasons. So they're sort of using this little unit as a catch-all for anybody who's exhibiting divergent behavior. So that meant that Brianna was being put into the same unit as kids who were being isolated from the rest of the school for violent outbreaks or other behavioral problems. You could see how this could potentially result in some issues if the wrong kids click up. You know, someone like Brianna, she's a little bit more submissive. She's more nervous, she's more timid. She's not the type to like lead the charge and be telling her friends what to do. Meanwhile, some of these kids who are maybe in there for selling drugs to the other kids at the school or fighting with the teachers, they're a little bit more likely to be more dominant, and that's not always a good thing. Obviously, in an ideal world, the hope is just that these kids who are exhibiting concerning behavior, who are a little bit more of troublemakers, they just need a little bit of attention, they just need somebody who really cares about them, and the teachers who are in charge of this unit will essentially be able to love them out of it, teach them that like there's better ways to express the frustration they might be feeling from what's going on at home or whatever it is that's causing them distress. And that meanwhile, these same teachers are able to tend to these children with completely different needs who are stressed out and anxious and not sure how to communicate with others at all. And from a 40,000 foot standpoint, you can see why these kids all end up in the same place, right? They are all having a hard time connecting in healthy ways with other kids. Brianna's parents hoped that her involvement in the inclusion unit would hopefully help her make some new friends. And they were so excited to learn that it did. Because one day, a new girl named Scarlett walked into the inclusion unit, and she actually had really cool eyeliner on, and this immediately caught Brianna's eye. And because she's so into makeup, that common ground made her feel comfortable enough to speak up and compliment this new girl on her eyeliner. Now, Scarlett's background is interesting as well. Investigators don't seem to consider her early life to have any sort of red flags, but I actually beg to differ. Obviously, I'm not an expert, so I'm not saying my opinion trumps their opinion in any way, shape, or form. I just feel like there's a couple things that at least stood out to me that I would like to point out, because maybe you guys will think that they're significant as well. Maybe you won't. The first thing that kind of puzzled investigators was the fact that Scarlett's parents were very happily married. Her mom was a teacher, her dad worked in construction, but he also mentored any new employees that were coming in. So in that way, both her mother and father were in mentorship roles, and they were doing incredibly well in those roles. Now, this isn't to say that everybody who's a great teacher is also a great parent, but I think it's fair to say that it certainly equips you with a lot of the tools that you may need. Scarlett was the youngest of 4 kids. She had 3 older brothers. She was the only girl, and she was the baby. So at this point in her life, there's no outward signs that we're aware of. There may be things that we're unaware of happening in the background, but from what we're aware of, this seems like a normal, stable, even healthy family situation. Despite this, by the time Scarlett was 11 years old, she claims that she was pretty heavily self-harming. Her parents say that they were totally ignorant to this. Her siblings don't seem to know anything about it either. She said that she was doing this out of anxiety. Like Brianna, she was also having a hard time making friends. Really, she didn't seem to like people, and more than that, people did not seem to like her. And in the same way that Brianna was sort of reaching out looking for human connection and just grabbed onto the first person who she could, that's sort of what happened with Scarlett and her friend Eddie from her old school. Eddie had a similar childhood in many ways to Scarlett. His parents were also happily married. His mom was a graphic designer. His dad was the manager of a truck company, but he also ran an amateur kickboxing gym. Eddie was the middle of 3 children. He had an older brother and a younger sister, but he diverges from Scarlett in 2 interesting ways. One, Eddie was the top of his class. Scarlett was not a very strong student. So this really contrasts them academically. Eddie studied very regularly, and his teachers were constantly praising his academic achievements. The second way that they diverge is, from what we're aware of, Scarlett doesn't seem to have had any real legitimate friction with any of her siblings. Meanwhile, Eddie had, I don't want to say a tumultuous relationship with his older brother, because I think that's a bit dramatic from what's been described, but they didn't have the strongest relationship. Eddie resented his older brother because his older brother would often make ableist comments, teasing him for being autistic. At this point in time, Eddie was undiagnosed, but he would later be diagnosed with autism. So it seems that Eddie took a lot of these comments to heart. It didn't really seem like sibling banter. It didn't feel playful or fun or like light teasing to him. Eddie likely knew that he was different than a lot of his peers, and so when his brother made those comments about him, I'm sure it genuinely struck a chord. And because of all this, it's not surprising to learn that Eddie was a really shy boy. So when he and Scarlett connected, it was equally exciting for the both of them. They both finally had a friend. So it's interesting that from what we know, neither of these two experienced any sort of parental neglect or just poor parenting in general. It doesn't seem that there was any sort of significant trauma that either of them could directly point to early on in life. However, they were both experiencing a lot of self-worth issues, and they were both exhibiting attention-seeking behavior just in different ways. And I suspect that they sensed this in one another, and that's where the bond really began to deepen, because like I said, I think Eddie could tell that he was different somehow than a lot of his peers, and he was probably grappling with that feeling, trying to figure out what the differences were. Meanwhile, it seems that Scarlett came to the same conclusion. He also knew that something about her was a little bit different, maybe a little bit off than a lot of her classmates, and that's why they failed to connect. So I think because of that, investigators might be just a little bit too quick to dismiss the implications of feeling so different from your peers and how that can manifest in weird ways and become its own sort of complex trauma. But that's just my completely unprofessional opinion. But what everyone is in agreement on is the fact that these two found each other and then began enabling and emphasizing one another's bad behavior. Scarlett was really into horror movies, and a lot of people are into horror movies. That's not in and of itself any sort of red flag, but what people did think was a little bit odd about how she approached them was most kids who are around like 13 years old are watching horror movies with a sort of shock and disgust, And it's really common, at least it was like for me in middle school, to like get a bunch of people together and watch a horror movie so you can all be scared together, and it's like a bonding experience. But Scarlett's introduction to this media was a lot different than that. She would just watch the movies by herself, and instead of feeling grossed out or horrified or scared, she was thrilled and impressed. And the actions in this type of media for her were really inspirational. She was a self-proclaimed Satanist because a lot of her favorite characters in this kind of media as a motif were Satanists. And even in her friendship with Eddie, he was actually the one who would attest to the fact that she was not a normal person, that she was off-putting and people didn't like her. And also, she was naturally very hostile to most people as well. He would talk about how she had really dark humor, and I think depending on like the culture of whenever you're going through your adolescence, dark humor goes in and out of vogue. Like in the early 2010s, there was a whole trend of making dead baby jokes all the time, which now would be pretty macabre. And Scarlett was still making those jokes, and that was sort of like her icebreaker joke, and then it would get significantly darker from there. And while Eddie was the top of his class and garnering a lot of praise from his teachers, which I think in and of itself, depending on the person, can be attention-seeking behavior too. He's seeking out praise. Could be a situation where if he thinks he really overachieves, does everything right, he might gain love and admiration and attention that maybe he's lacking in other areas. But that's also not always the case. Some people just really love school. But in juxtaposition to that, in 2022, Scarlett was actually expelled from school because she was caught dealing gummies to her classmates. Because of this, of course, she was forced to switch schools. But, you know, her and Eddie had developed this really close friendship, so they still kept in touch, even though they didn't go to the same school anymore. They didn't hang out a lot in person because it was a little inconvenient. He would have to take the bus, she would have to walk a while. So the vast majority of their relationship from 2022 forward took place over social media and text. Unlike most teenagers, the majority of their conversations were not that interesting to an outside observer. It was just normal stuff like, how's school? Do you like anybody? Blah, blah, blah. But even still, a significant portion of those conversations involved some really dark subjects. They talked a lot about gore, they talked a lot about violence, and they talked a lot about death. At one point, Eddie actually messaged Scarlett complaining because there was a boy at school who his crush was hanging out with a lot, and he was feeling really threatened by it. He didn't like how much they were hanging out. So he started saying a lot of really aggressive things to Scarlett, saying things like he was gonna kill him. And Scarlett went along with it right away. In fact, to a point where Eddie actually texted her and said verbatim, "I thought he was your friend, but you don't seem to mind me killing him." To which Scarlett responded, and I quote, "He is my friend, to be honest, but I still don't mind you killing him. I'd help you too. Just ask me to do it and I will do it. I will try to kill him. Wear a mask, use a voice changer, and keep him away from redacted," which I would assume is the crush's name. To which Eddie responded in kind with, "I'll let you decide what to do with him. If you kill him, I would like for you to do as you see fit. Cut out his heart, cook it, and feed it to your dog." To be fair, even though these are really concerning and like intense messages, I just want to be fair and acknowledge the fact that a lot of times teenagers will text things that are out of character or disingenuous because they're edgelords. It could very easily just be your teenager and one of their friends are trying to impress each other, see who can be darker, more mysterious, more edgy, waiting till they can get the other person to be like, "Whoa, I think that's a little intense," and they can be like, "Sorry, I'm just in my Joker era." But obviously, given the way events escalate, this is not that. This is something that is truly a point of concern, and retrospectively, it's a massive red flag. The next escalation after this that I think is really truly super important happens on December 5th of 2023. And this is when Scarlett sends what's described as an ad to Eddie for a dark website that involves R-word, torture, and murder. And alongside the ad, her message reads as follows: "I love watching torture vids, real ones on the dark web. I've liked this stuff for a while. I finally found a good red room." Now, I want to explain, for those of you who don't know a lot about the dark web, what exactly all of that meant, because there is a little bit of jargon involved. First and foremost, the internet, as most people know it, think of it like an iceberg. So an iceberg only shows a little bit above the surface of the water and generally is much bigger below. That's basically how the internet works. There's only a small part of the internet that's controlled and regulated and monitored, basically so that it's safe for the average user. That's where like Google, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, even things like 9gag that some people consider to be more peripheral, a little bit more edgy, they're all still on the user-friendly part of the internet that everybody has access to. Now, at the same time, there's this huge other under the water iceberg part of the internet that is completely unregulated. And while governments monitor it so that they can try and catch criminals who are utilizing the dark web, they don't have any actual control over the dark web for the most part. And the only way that you can access this part of the internet is if you have a thing called a Tor. And without getting too specific, because I'm not trying to like give you guys a tutorial on how to like access the dark web in detail or anything, a Tor essentially works like a portal so that you can get on to this other side of the internet that you wouldn't be able to access otherwise, that your web browser cannot and will not take you to. We know that Scarlett wasn't bluffing about using the dark web because on her phone she had a Tor. So she had one of these little portals so that you can get onto that part of the internet. Now, when you use a Tor and you get onto the dark web, that part of the internet, it's not structured in the way that the part of the internet you're used to using is. So it's not an easy interface to use. It's not a situation where you just go and there's just Google in black and you type in illegal things and they pop up. It doesn't work like that. I don't know if it's gotten more streamlined, I doubt it, but it used to be a situation where you would have to be a little good at coding or at least have somebody else who's already navigated the dark web to just show you the easiest ways to get around on it. Those green links can be literally anything. It's like a roll of the dice. It could be drugs. It could just be a random web page that's not doing anything. It could be human trafficking. It could be black market organ sales, you know, like you just don't know. A lot of the dark web is used for buying and selling drugs, but of course there's a lot scarier stuff on there. I also just want to take a moment and say nobody should go on the dark web. I don't recommend doing that. It's just not a safe thing to do. First of all, I know a lot of people have a natural curiosity about it. They might want to check it out. You're not going to see anything on there that you like if you're a normal person. It also is just a dangerous thing to do. You open yourself up to a lot of very scary people. It's not uncommon for amateurs to get on there and then some hacker somewhere in the world turns on their webcam and now they can see you, or locates your IP address and now they know where your house is. So I just want to make it really clear it's not something that you should be doing. It's not a good idea. You can put yourself in a truly precarious position just by getting on there. So it really is a situation where curiosity can kill the cat, and I don't want that to happen to you guys. Getting off my soapbox, so what is a red room? This is an imperfect analogy, but in the way that there's people who make all of their money off of live streaming on TikTok or YouTube or Twitch, there is a similar thing that can happen on the dark web. So a red room is when somebody is live streaming something illegal. So it could be terrorist groups are live streaming executions. It could be vor, it could be human traffickers torturing people. It could be serial killers killing people on camera for a live audience. I've heard that sometimes there's a chat, people can interact, make requests. Investigators who work for the FBI or different police departments have and do monitor a lot of red rooms. And across the board, anybody who is working on the investigation side who has had to enter one of these red rooms has needed extensive therapy and counseling to even begin to process and compartmentalize the things that they have seen. There are absolutely no limits to what you might see in one of these kinds of rooms. So for someone like Scarlett, who is a young person, to just be casually consuming this kind of content on a regular basis, not just seeking it out in some sort of misguided attempt to be edgy, but actively viewing it and then cycling through different red rooms until she finds one that's entertaining enough for her, paints a very horrific image psychologically. There are full-fledged adults, frontal lobe closed, trained to watch this kind of content, who are mentally debilitated by the things that they're seeing. So the psychological ramifications of somebody who is as young as Scarlett is to be watching this on a regular basis are immense, and I can't emphasize that enough. The fact that Scarlett felt comfortable not only telling Eddie that she frequents these kinds of rooms, but the fact that he didn't have any sort of negative reaction. In fact, all of his reactions to anything out of pocket or scary or concerning that Scarlett has said via text up until this point, they've all been neutral or positive responses. And the same goes for Scarlett's response is to Eddie. It's a situation where every single time one of them ups the stakes in terms of the severity and intensity of these conversations, the other just meets them at that level. So when Scarlett is kicked out of her old school for dealing, she starts at a new school. And because she's exhibited this poor behavior resulting in her expulsion at her old school, at her new school, she's placed in an inclusion unit so that her teachers can watch her a little more closely. And like I said, that's where she meets Brianna, and they have that initial interaction about makeup. That day after school, Scarlett texts Eddie and she updates him on her experience at her new school and the fact that she's made a new friend. She sends him a message detailing the fact that she's met somebody and she is, quote, obsessed with them, but that she doesn't have any sort of romantic feelings. She just can't stop thinking about them. And she ends her message with a comment that I'm not gonna repeat, but it makes it clear to Eddie that Brianna is transgender. After this, Eddie asks Scarlett to clarify how she felt when she met Brianna, because he's trying to suss out if she's in love with this person or not. Scarlett basically says that her heart was racing and she was excited, but she didn't feel like she was in love. And throughout this conversation, instead of Eddie referring to Brianna as she or them or her, he keeps referring to Brianna as it. And then of course he inevitably follows up with a slew of transphobic comments. I think it's really important to highlight the use of the word it and just the general transphobia, because when you're referring to somebody in that way, you're completely objectifying that person. You're dehumanizing that person. Whatever empathy you typically extend to other human beings is now off the table because verbiage-wise, you've stopped considering that person a person. He's just constantly dehumanizing her. And Eddie ends the conversation by saying, quote, I don't think you're in love. I think you're just obsessed with its unfamiliar nature. Unsurprisingly, I'm not a fan of Eddie. And at this time, Scarlett, who is clearly on record for being a bad friend because she had already owned up to the fact that she not only didn't care if Eddie was going to kill one of her other few friends that she had, but that she would help him, Scarlett is silent. Silence is violence. She doesn't defend Brianna at all. She's just laughing along. Just another example of her and Eddie enabling one another's poor behavior. Then in early 2023, the stakes are upped once again because Eddie and Scarlett decide to make an official hit list. And their list is 5 people long. The first person on the list is a boy who Eddie considered to be a nonce. That's like a British insult. The second is a boy who told Scarlett's teachers that she was on pills and LSD, which may or may not be true. I have no idea. The third and fourth are boys who were rude to Scarlett's boyfriend that she had had at some point in time. And then the fifth was Brianna. Each of the names on this hit list were accompanied by a detailed plan for how Eddie and Scarlett would approach killing each of these 5 people. This would include locations like Linear Park and descriptions such as, Eddie, you come up behind him, slit his throat, I'll stab him in the back. So this wasn't a list where you would just see 5 random names and be like, what does this mean? If you were to find this list, it would be abundantly clear right away what you were looking at. And it seemed that each person on this list was on it for petty reasons. Like nobody had committed any sort of major slight against Eddie or Scarlett. So either Eddie and Scarlett hold insane grudges, which is entirely possible, or, which I think is more likely, Eddie and Scarlett had a desire to hurt somebody, and because of that desire, they were trying to shoehorn in people who they felt would deserve to be victimized, which is of course no one, but you know, this is the thought process of 2 incredibly unstable people who are enabling one another. Now, just a few weeks before the crime that this video is actually about was committed, Scarlett decided to make an Instagram in an attempt to lure one of the boys off of this hit list into meeting her at Linear Park. For whatever reason, the boy did not take the bait, and when she had DM'd him from this new fake account, maybe it was just really obviously fake, the boy actually immediately blocked the account. So Scarlett's plan was a complete and total failure. And because Scarlett's idea didn't work, she and Eddie decided to go down a different path. They decided to move forward with the 5th person on this list, which was Brianna. Why Brianna? What did Brianna do? And the answer is nothing. Brianna never did anything to deserve any sort of violence. Even if she had committed some sort of social slight at some point in time. Obviously, she would never deserve to be targeted, but she had actually done nothing. The reason that Scarlett and Eddie decided to add Brianna to the list was purely due to proximity. None of the other 4 on the list liked or trusted Scarlett and Eddie. So if they tried to invite them to Lanier Park, the park that they had decided was the ideal location to commit a crime, those 4 weren't gonna go. They were like, you want me to come meet you at some creepy park? I don't even like seeing you at school. Hence why Scarlett tried to make a fake account to contact these people. Meanwhile, Brianna not only liked Scarlett and Eddie by extension, but trusted Scarlett and Eddie. If Scarlett asked Brianna to come meet her at the park, Brianna would not only accept, she would be excited to go. She was trying her best to put herself out there, to make friends, to overcome the limitations of her social anxiety. And Eddie and Scarlett not only knew that, they were relying on it. Eddie and Scarlett were so comfortable with one another at this point that they openly fantasized about killing Brianna together. Eddie went so far as to say things like, I want to see if it screams like a boy or a girl. And I think it's important to note that the transgender community is one of the most vulnerable communities on the planet. And unfortunately, it is not uncommon for people in the transgender community to be victims of violence. After a lot of back and forth and meticulous planning on Eddie and Scarlett's part, they decided on January 27th for the date to invite Brianna out to the park. Scarlett texted Brianna inviting her out to the park to do Pepsi. Once Brianna accepts, then Scarlett immediately starts texting Eddie back and forth, talking logistics, planning things out. They agree that they should go to the park first, survey the area, make sure that their spot is clear, then go meet Brianna together at the bus stop, walk her to the park together, and then, of course, commit the crime. The tone of this conversation, even though it is over text, is incredibly casual. Scarlett lays out the timeline. Eddie responds simply by saying, am I still the one bringing the knife? Because just a few weeks prior, his father had actually bought him a hunting knife on a ski trip, and he wasn't sure if it would be sharp enough, to which Scarlett responds, yes, and she follows up by saying it's definitely sharp enough, by the way. They then discussed how Eddie should be the one to grab Brianna and initially slit her throat, and that Scarlett, in her own words, wanted to get at least a few stabs in just to see what it feels like. So she was planning on quite literally stabbing her in the back. At this point in the conversation, it occurs to them that it would likely be beneficial for them to come up with a code word system. So they agree on 2 code words. The first one being for when Eddie should start preparing the knife. Scarlett decides in order to signal him that it's time to start preparing the knife, she's gonna cough, at which point he'll take it out and get it ready when Brianna's not paying attention, I suppose. The second code word is for when he is to attack, which they decided should be the word gay. But unbeknownst to Brianna, her mother would actually end up saving her life. Because the thing was, they had actually scheduled a family dinner. Brianna had totally forgotten about it when she agreed to go meet Eddie and Scarlett at the park. And so she ended up texting Scarlett sort of last second and canceling. But it would seem the fact that Scarlett had gotten closer than she had ever gotten to achieving this goal, only to be let down once again, would only fuel the fire. Because after Brianna canceled, Scarlett became even more obsessed. She was texting Eddie every single day, random times, being like, what about today at 7 o'clock? Meet me at the park at 8 p.m. today. And he would almost always respond that he can't. As we know, he was really studious, and Scarlett, who didn't really care much for her grades, kept texting Eddie plans for them to commit this crime on a school night. So he would respond saying, I can't go out tonight, it's a school night, I have to study. A lot of these texts at this point in time, Eddie is treating Scarlett as if she's a coworker and they're just trying to logistically plan out a project, but he's got other priorities. The tone of all of this is so strange. I think it really puzzled a lot of investigators because it's so detached. But these texts definitely show one thing definitively, which is that Scarlett is much more motivated than Eddie is to commit this specific murder. That's not to say that Eddie isn't also equally responsible, but it's this sort of weird situation where there's these 2 personalities that are sort of precarious, I guess you could say. And the way that they happen to mix creates the worst possible end result. But anyway, they keep logistically going back and forth, trying to find a good time and date. And at one point when Scarlett is pleading with Eddie to just clear his calendar, she says, and I quote, "I just want to see her dead ASAP." So like they're literally treating this murder planning process as if they're trying to schedule a Zoom call. Shortly thereafter, Scarlett texts Eddie a photo of a handwritten note and she's detailing the full plan and the full crime in such like clear-cut terms as like she actually wrote out victim, Brianna, crime, murder. And she sets the date for this crime as Saturday, February 11th, 2023. So this happened a year ago last week. Eddie finally agrees to this date and Scarlett is overjoyed. So Friday, February 10th arrives. And before I get into like the description of this next conversation, I just want to emphasize to you guys, I do not consider the events of this video to be casual at all. They're obviously incredibly tragic. This is a major trauma that affected countless people, and I personally am really emotionally affected when I make these videos. I need time to like mentally recover after the research process. It's like a whole thing for me, but I do truly feel like these videos are important. I just want to make that clear because this next conversation discusses all of this in such a casual tone that I just don't want you guys to forget that these people are discussing a very real crime that really happened to real people. The day before, Scarlett texts Brianna and she invites her to the park. Once Brianna says yes, then Scarlett texts Eddie and she says, "I'm excited AF for tomorrow." Eddie responds and he's like, "What's tomorrow?" At which point Scarlett is like, "We're gonna kill Brianna tomorrow." And then Eddie replies saying, "Oh, I totally forgot. How?" And Eddie says simply, "I was eating." So not only was it super casual, but it's just like a strange interaction. The next day, we see through Brianna's home's ring light her walking out the door, and then we see her again on CCTV when she gets on the bus. While she's on the bus, she actually texts her mom twice because she's feeling really anxious about going out to meet people, and then she's also anxious about being on the bus alone, which is just like such a sad interaction to me, just because it's so relatable. Like there's so many things when you're a teenager that are like totally normal for adults. Like public transport is truly not that big of a deal, but if you're not used to doing those things, and if you're an anxious person as is, it can just be really nerve-wracking and you're just feeling really unsure because you're just so new to the world still. It's like such an innocent interaction, I think, is what troubles me about it. And she clearly had a really healthy relationship with her mom, not only because her mom was like obviously very accepting of her identity, but just the fact that she feels comfortable leaning on her mom whenever she's feeling a little anxious like that. It just goes to show that her mother was a soft space to land for her. And I just really feel for her and her mother, because the absence of losing this relationship must be just such an incredible weight. Brianna then exits the bus and sees that Scarlett and Eddie are waiting for her at the bus stop as promised. Brianna wore a really cute outfit that day. She's wearing a white hoodie, she's wearing a mini skirt, and she's wearing thigh-high socks. I know it's February in the UK, so it was actually very cold, and the only reason why her outfit is relevant at all, because typically it wouldn't be, is because the walk to the park was 10 to 15 minutes, and to get there you had to walk past a lot of shops. So a lot of the people who Brianna had walked past just like casually on her way to the park actually remember seeing her, because not only was her outfit distinct, but a lot of the older people, you know how older people are, were worried that she was going to be too cold. And on top of that, as they're walking past all of these shops to get to the park, most of these shops also have their own CCTV footage as well. So almost the entire walk to the park is fully documented on camera. But the park itself did not have any cameras. And when they got into the park, they walked quite a ways into the park as well, because naturally Eddie and Scarlett were trying to avoid any onlookers. While Brianna was likely thinking that they were only going so deep into the park and into such a secluded area because previously, when Scarlett had invited her to the park the first time, she had mentioned doing Pepsi together. And so she's probably thinking to herself, of course we're going to this secluded location because obviously we don't want to get caught. At 3:06, Brianna would text Scarlett, "Girl, where are you?" Which leads us to believe that Brianna had been separated or abandoned in the woods. And just 7 to 10 minutes after Brianna had sent this message to a girl who she thought was her friend, that very same girl would stab her to death. Tragically, Brianna would be stabbed a total of 24 times, 12 of which were in the back. And a lot of these knife wounds were up to 5 inches deep, which meant that the entirety of the blade down to the hilt was entering Brianna's body. This was obviously an incredibly violent stabbing, and when a murder has this level of violence, it's almost always because there is some sort of extreme anger behind it. There are high levels of anger present that are directed at either the individual or, in some cases, what they may represent. And if this stabbing went according to Scarlett's plan, that would mean that Eddie was the one to initiate the stabbing, but that Scarlett would then take over. But like many components of Scarlett's plan, the location and the time were ill-conceived. There were other people in the park. This is broad daylight. It doesn't actually matter how deep you're in the park. The chances of somebody else coming across you are still incredibly high. This is a popular public park. And it would just so happen that at the time of the stabbing, there were 2 dog walkers who would come upon the scene, Mr. and Mrs. Weiss. When they first came upon it, they were quite a ways away, and so all they could really see was that there were 2 people who looked to be young people, likely teenagers, standing over something. So they continued on their path, getting closer and closer. But it wasn't long before they got close enough to realize what it was that they were truly looking at. And even though they were still at a bit of a distance, it was very clear what they were looking at. The 2 teens that they had initially noticed were standing over a girl whose body was very unnaturally contorted on the steps, whose white hoodie was soaked crimson with blood. Once they realized this, they immediately distanced themselves further, and Mrs. Weiss calls 999, which is the UK equivalent of 911. While talking to dispatch, she frantically explains that she's not sure if the girl is alive or dead because she can't see her face, and she's worried that she may already be dead. And as Mrs. Weiss turns to look back at the scene, she sees Scarlett from a distance, standing there, staring directly at her before running off. By 3:25, PC are delivering CPR to Brianna as the paramedics are rushing to the scene. Officials spent 40 minutes attempting to revive her, but by 4:02, Brianna was pronounced dead at the scene. Meanwhile, Scarlett and Eddie are fleeing the scene. And as they're running away, Scarlett throws Brianna's phone down a sewer drain before running the rest of the way home. Meanwhile, Eddie gets on the bus and returns to his home as well. Digital records show that both of them got online right away and started Googling the case. And in some sort of misguided and sloppy attempt to cover up the crime, Scarlett texts Eddie saying that her brother has just told her she can't go to the local park, that some girl has been attacked there, to which Eddie responds, feigning ignorance, talking about how crazy it is, how scary it is, who would have thought. To me, in this case, there's a lot of things that are very directly influenced by how young these killers are, but this exchange is one of the most glaring ones because it shows a certain level of awareness that text could potentially be used as evidence, which is why they're creating this false narrative. That being said, all of their planning has also happened via text on these very same devices. And then on top of that, later that night, Scarlett texts Eddie blatantly asking if he's worried that he's gonna get caught, to which Eddie says probably, and then Scarlett reassures him that they're not gonna get caught, immediately after their previous texts feigning ignorance to the crime. Meanwhile, the investigation is well underway. First and foremost, there were 2 soda bottles left at the scene of the crime, and naturally those were taken off to DNA testing right away. One of the first things that officials are going to do in this situation is check any and all local CCTV that could have possibly picked up Brianna on her way to the park, at which point they very clearly see Brianna accompanied by Scarlett and Eddie from the bus stop to the park, and then they see Scarlett and Eddie leaving the park without Brianna. And in addition to Scarlett texting Eddie trying to cover up this crime, she also made the decision to text Brianna, basically feigning anger at her, saying, "I can't believe that you just ran off with some guy. It's really uncool for you to ditch us. Girl, where are you?" And she's doing this because her cover-up story is going to be that Brianna had been talking to some 17-year-old from Manchester, that Eddie and Scarlett don't know any other details than that. They don't know how they met. They're assuming they met online, and that after they got to the park with Brianna, she informed them shortly thereafter that she had to go because she was going to meet up with this guy. At which point, Scarlett and Eddie were just salty because she ditched them to hang out with some dude she doesn't even know. Basically, the implication there is that they're going to try and then frame this made-up person for having killed Brianna, or maybe even somebody else killed her when she was on her way there. But it's just a classic case of them trying to point blame away from themselves, and it's obviously not done well. But what's really important about all of this is that Scarlett echoes that same false narrative to her own mother. Her mother's a teacher, her mother's a mandated reporter, her mother is concerned because one of her daughter's friends has just been viciously attacked, and that could have been her daughter because she doesn't know all of this messed up stuff that Scarlett's into. She's just a concerned mom, a concerned community member, a concerned teacher. So when Scarlett tells her that Brianna was talking to some boy online, she automatically thinks, like, I have to report this because this might be important information. If she ran off to see some boy, that might have been the last person who ever saw her. Because the details of the case are not public yet. Her mom doesn't know that, like, 2 teens were seen standing over her or anything like that. She just knows that Brianna was attacked and killed viciously in the local park. So she calls 999 and tells them what she knows. And then she makes her daughter get on the phone and echo this same story, basically a classic, now tell them what you told me situation. And of course, she parrots to the cops the same vague story that she told her mom and that she texted Brianna. She then texts Eddie after all of this and says, like, hey, I didn't go to the police, but my mom did because I told her that Brianna ran off to see some boy and she got worried. So this is exactly what I told the cops. You need to repeat this same story so that we're on the same page. Scarlett then gets on social media and posts a picture of Brianna with a caption about how it's so messed up that this happened to her. She was such a good person. It's crazy that something so terrible would happen to her. And within just a few hours of all of this, Scarlett and Eddie are arrested. They're taken in for questioning. They're told right away that they're the primary suspects. There's actually footage of Scarlett asking, like, why am I the primary suspect? Like, what's the reason? Is it because I was the last person to see her? Basically, very clearly trying to, like, glean what evidence the police may have on her, and the cops aren't having it. They're like, I don't know, I just know I'm supposed to come here and collect you. They're not answering any of her questions, and they're not giving her anything to work with. And because of this, Scarlett and Eddie both feel decently confident in their ability to work with the police because they don't know what they have on them. So they enter the questioning process totally cooperative, willing to answer whatever questions. Scarlett continues to peddle this false narrative, but it very quickly becomes clear that the police have a lot more evidence on them than they were prepared for the police to have. On top of that, when Eddie is asked about this story about this boy from Manchester, he doesn't corroborate any of that. His story is that he went to the park with Scarlett and Brianna, he stepped away to go pee behind a tree, and when he came back, he saw Scarlett stabbing Brianna to death. At that point, he knelt down, he tried to check on Brianna, see if she was okay, but his hands got covered in blood and that freaked him out. And so he ran away. The cops ask him where was she bleeding from. He says everywhere. They ask him why he didn't report it. He just says that he was in shock and he ended up walking home with Scarlett. They ask how he felt during that time, and he says that he was shocked and he was confused and, in his own words, upset, of course. And then when they asked him what Scarlett's demeanor was like, he says that she was calm and totally nonchalant. So he's very clearly pinning all of the blame on to Scarlett. But this doesn't end up working out well for Eddie at all, because while all of this was happening, the police had checked Eddie's room and Scarlett's room, during which time they found that handwritten note in Scarlett's room that clearly laid out victim, Brianna, crime, murder, with their entire plan, the plan that they literally followed through on essentially to a T. While at Eddie's house, they found the murder weapon, and it is clearly the very same knife that they had previously discussed in their messages to one another. At this point, Scarlett and Eddie stop cooperating. They definitely take a plead the fifth approach, and they no longer are aiding in the investigation in any meaningful way. It's starting to occur to them that they might not get away with this. Meanwhile, this story is spiraling in the news cycle, and vigils are starting to pop up all over the UK because people are treating this rightfully as the terrible tragedy that it is. And although this is all in the news, like I said at the beginning of the video, up until this point, because of everyone's ages, the only name that is out in the public is Brianna's. Scarlett and Eddie are completely anonymous at this point. And before trial, they have to go through a pre-trial mental health assessment. During this brief mental health assessment, experts concluded that Scarlett has ADHD, she clearly has anxiety, and she has very mild autism. Autism has levels like level 1, level 2, level 3, but I also want to point out it's not a linear spectrum. It's more like a starburst where it falls in different areas that way. So when they say she has mild autism, it just means she's falling closer to the center of this chart rather than it being a traditional sliding scale situation. In Eddie's assessment, he is officially diagnosed with autism as well. And of course, his autism presents a bit differently than Scarlett's, but it's not considered by the experts who were assessing him to be as mild as Scarlett's, which, like, the easiest way to put that, I guess, is just that Eddie's symptoms of autism were more outwardly obvious. In addition to that, they concluded that he had extremely high levels of anxiety. And at this point in the investigation, Eddie had also become nearly nonverbal. This is something that can happen to people who have autism when they're under high amounts of stress. Because autism can present differently in different people, there are some people with autism who are always nonverbal, or predominantly nonverbal, or are selectively mute, so maybe they only talk to a few people. Whereas other people may not typically struggle with being verbal, yet if they're under high amounts of stress, which you likely would be if you're in pre-trial for a murder charge, they may become nonverbal as a result of that stress, or at the very least become selectively mute. And that's the case for Eddie. He was really only able to consistently speak to his mother, and he was nonverbal in basically all his other interactions. Experts also concluded that it is suggested that the motive for both Eddie and Scarlett was just sadistic, that they wanted to see somebody get hurt, they wanted to see what it was like, they wanted to experience inflicting pain on somebody else like that. With Scarlett in particular, they didn't have enough time with her to confidently diagnose her with antisocial personality disorder, but post-trial, when Scarlett was assessed in a little bit more depth, experts did conclude that she, at the very least, exhibits some elements of antisocial personality disorder. Experts also came to the conclusion that these two personalities coming together in the way that they did essentially created the perfect storm. Then on November 27th, 2023, they went to trial. The trial itself is a little bit controversial because Eddie was given pretty heavy accommodations due to his selective mutism. A lot of people felt like the court was handling Eddie and Scarlett with kitty gloves and that they were being too gentle with them. And I can certainly see how the general public would come to that conclusion, because rather than having to verbalize his plea, Eddie was allowed to just write down "not guilty" on a piece of paper and show it. In addition to that, whenever questioning happened, Eddie was moved into a separate room. The questions were typed out, given to him. He typed out his answers, and then somebody else would go and read them in front of the jury. So it is very clear that the court was handling Eddie very delicately. The rationale for that, and this is what the court said in its defense, is that the entire purpose of this whole thing is to have a successful trial. And through the eyes of the court, a successful trial doesn't mean, oh, they were innocent or oh, they were guilty. It just means that the trial came to a full completion, that all those involved were able to fully go through the legal process as it is and get whatever answer they got. And so the reason why they gave Eddie the accommodations that they did is because it was clear that his mental state was deteriorating, and they were concerned it would deteriorate to a point where he would no longer be able to participate in the trial at all. And then all those involved would be forced to put the trial on hold and then wait until Eddie was considered fit for trial again. And so although it might look like the courts were babying Eddie, the reason that he was receiving all of these accommodations, beyond the fact that it seems that he required them in order to actually participate, was actually out of sympathy for the victim's family. If you can keep the trial short rather than having it drag on for maybe years, of course you want to do that. You want to give the victim's family as much closure as you can, as soon as you can. And that was the court's true goal. It was a 5-day testimony period, and for basically the entire period, it was just Eddie and Scarlett blaming one another for this crime, which is not surprising. I mean, there's so much evidence against Eddie and Scarlett. There's no getting away with this. There's no getting a not guilty plea. All that they can really hope is that they can plead down, pin it mainly on the other person, try and minimize their role as much as possible so they'll potentially get a lighter sentence, or maybe they can even plead that they've been heavily influenced by this other person and try and go for some sort of accessory charge. But honestly, that was never really going to happen. And with this case in particular, a lot of people were wondering, are Scarlett and Eddie dumb or arrogant? Because there was such an insane amount of evidence. And I think the answer is a little bit of both, but mainly it just comes down to the fact that their frontal lobes weren't developed, and so they just did not think this through in any sort of realistic way. For them, this was like a fantasy that they were trying to manifest, and when you're young and you're fantasizing about something, you don't really like to dwell on the logistics or potential consequences or potential cons. If this is something that you're really looking forward to and you really want to do, you're going to diminish all of those things. And I think that's exactly what happened here. To me, it's just like incredibly unsurprising that children would be bad at crime. Like, of course, they're going to have a childlike mindset, they're children. Also, unsurprisingly, the deliberation period by the jury was very short, and they were both found guilty. Then on February 2nd, 2023, basically directly after sentencing, Scarlett actually admitted to a psychologist that she had stabbed Brianna, which during the entire trial, she was trying to act like she didn't actually stab her and it was all Eddie. But right when sentencing wrapped, she admitted that she had stabbed Brianna, that Eddie had initiated the attack, completely messed up, totally failed, and that then Scarlett took over and she was the one to stab Brianna fatally. And when the psychologist asked her how much she stabbed her, she just simply said a lot. So it's entirely possible that like the vast majority of the wounds were inflicted by Scarlett. She also adds on that she had initially planned to take a piece of Brianna's body as some sort of trophy, which is truly horrifying. After the case closed, Brianna's mom gave a really heartbreaking press release where she said that going into the trial, she actually felt a lot of sympathy, bordering on guilt, for Scarlett and Eddie because they were so young, and she had gone in thinking like they were confused, they didn't know what they did, like this is just a terrible situation for all the families involved, like this is so horrible. But then after seeing the way that they testified in court and the things that they said, she lost all sympathy for them, and she was just truly horrified by the way that they conducted themselves and the way that they were. It's just truly such a sad situation. There's really no winners here. I mean, Scarlett's family is destroyed, Eddie's family is destroyed, and of course Brianna's family is destroyed. And it's just truly so sad. It's just so sad to see somebody who seemed like such a kind, loving person, especially with the impact that Brianna had online. She touched a lot of people's lives. And it's just so horrible to see something so unjustifiable happen to anybody, let alone somebody who seemed so genuinely sweet. If you made it this far, thank you so much. I'm sorry that I didn't post on Saturday. I'll see you guys next Saturday for sure. And if you're not already subscribed, it really does help me. So I would really appreciate that. Also, you may have heard Lana snoring in the background. She fell asleep partway through, so sorry about that. Bye!